7 out of the 10 emerging cities or fastest growing cities and fastest growing countries you'll find in Africa. So that's where we are. How therefore we reflect on Brics in that particular context becomes relevant and important. And part of South Africa's foreign policy is clearly linked to the issue of whatever we do here impacts profoundly in the broader space of Africa and other way around. So we believe that the Brics must be able to respond to the deeper development of Africa and its potential. So whatever we do as South Africa must be seen in the image of the growth in Africa. There are 3 realities that we deal with whilst we're dealing with this debate. We've heard earlier the issue of inclusive growth in the context of shared growth. We are looking at the questions of inequality, poverty reduction, and unemployment. The Brics countries, as it constitute, represent roughly 43% of the world population. It represents at least 23 to 25% of the world GDP. So what we are starting to say is let's define that moment for us through governance principles. And there you would have seen more than 30 of the countries in Africa has already decided to voluntarily be part of the African peer review mechanism. It says a lot, where we, as peers, are reflecting on the institutional mechanisms and the governance goal in each of our countries to say how do we strengthen our governance principles in the various countries. We are seeing a regional integration focus that is on the merge around reflecting on how we move towards a free trade approach where we can interact much more directly with each other. Now, if you look at Europe's intra-trade, it speaks to 70%. If you look at intra-trade in Africa, it speaks to the lowest stats that you'll pick up, it's 10%, highest stats that you'll pick up with 15% damn stats. So it can be either of that, but the reality is low. And we are saying that as we engage in the Brics environment, issues of beneficiation, issues of added value, issues of regional integration and cooperation. And there is part of the legacy initiatives of this Brics Summit, we talk about the think tank, the geopolitical analysis and the strategic analysis of the world in terms of where do we want to see some of the international institutions go to in the forthcoming years. So there's a debate around that think tank process. At the level of the academic forum, we are reflecting on that as well, amongst the Brics nations. Now the issue of academia and skills becomes critical. So a debate around protocols, around retention of skills and skills flight. And what is that debate? We've seen not so long ago where 1,000 health professionals in Ghana, where taxpayers' money of the Ghanaians were used to invest to make sure that the Ghanaian people are able to get 1,000 health practitioners, doctors. Not long after they've graduated, they were in fact taken up in some European countries and in Canada. So here you've got $100 million used by the Ghanaian people, invested for skills, needy skills in their own communities, and a beneficiary, a kind of a developed nations getting the benefit of that. That's the type of debate when we speak about the skills intervention, because we'll see all the infrastructural potential. The second last point around infrastructure is telecoms industry and infrastructure intervention, north, south, east, west access. If you take the map of Africa, you'll see all roads leads in a sense to the harbors, where raw material then leaves and it comes back in different forms. And we are saying let's re-debate all of that, even in the context of Brics. So it is a qualitative discussion, it is not a us and them discussion. And all Brics countries are prepared to engage on that equally. The issue about development aid, the historical notion where development aid comes into Africa through essentially conditionalities. As South Africa, we are also saying we are re-engaging that debate through what we call the South African Development Partnership Agency. issue of partnership. So civil society does play a critical role for us. Governments play a critical role, and the private sector plays a critical role. But we will not make assumption that because of the private sector investments, therefore poverty reduction will happen. Because of the private sector interventions, therefore inequalities will be reduced. We are saying there must be a particular balance in that debate, and that's the type of introductions that South Africa will engage on it. But we do believe whatever we do must be seen in the image and in the mirror of Africa's development and not South Africa as an island on that. Those are just some of them.
Thank you very much, Deputy Minister. I mean, we've had some of these conversations in terms of the ideals of Brics, what we'd like to achieve. But I think what people are asking now is the how. And I would like to think that with the think tanks and papers that have been presented, that has been discussed as well. So are we saying that, for instance, the international management systems are not working, global financial systems are not adequate, that are in place? And if so, how does Brics intend to improve on that? You speak about the involvement of civil society, and it was said before, transparency is important, access to information. Perhaps, Minister, I could ask you to answer some of those. And the issue of inequality within the Brics members, the contribution perhaps that they might make to the bank, the development bank, will it result in sort of a $1 one vote situation, or are we going to have contribution overshadow that of so-called lesser partners?
That's under discussion over the next day or two. Our finance ministers has in fact put in place substantial progress. We can now say that there is, amongst all the Brics countries, there's an agreement that this is essential. It's an important to have a development bank. So you'd pick up that a month or 2 or 3 ago, there was a different debate. There was still a question around it. So that has been answered. Then there would be discussions over the next day or two around, especially in the financing institutions, the ministries, around would it be, for example, equal vote or proportional in the context of what you are putting in as the participants. That we do have positions around that, and I do think that we are closer to what the public would assume on that, but really I think that's the debate as it is, not to give that information, because heads of states will in fact be able to pronounce on those details, but that's exactly the debate. As we believe it should be one where we are looking at a much more equitable relation into all of that. We understand many times, I think when we've joined the Brics as South Africa, there was many skeptics said, but you are only 50 million and you are joining a family of a billion population. And we said it's 50 million in the context of a 1 billion population in Africa. And therefore we are reflecting on the regulatory frameworks, and a lot of those things has been discussed through the financing departments of Brics. A lot of thought has gone through that. Even the issue about civil society that you've raised. If you take South Africa, we do ascribe to the public finance management legislation. We ascribe to review programs. We reflect on Section 9 institutions. And clearly, many of those things that we, in terms of our constitutional values and those imperatives, will then also reflect on that in the context of some of that regulatory framework. So, concerns around civil society, I think there would be justice in that perception that it should not be one where it is decisions which is not accountable, etc., etc. And I think all that debate we are reflecting on, and we believe we've got a very resilient civil society, and therefore we'll be able to find that balance in that particular context.
Saifa, perhaps I could just get you to respond to the whole concern about civil society and access to information. China was cited, spoke about efficiency in aid, and the connection with free flow of information, transparency, etc. That certainly has been raised as a question in terms of matching the objectives or even the ideologies of Brics countries. If, for instance, you go from company to company with your investment, are you going to apply the same principles as Brics countries? Because all of that is related.
Thank you, Jane. I think this question is really relevant, and then I think to answer it, we need to have a sort of a long-term reflection. Actually, if we talk about aid from Chinese side, we need to understand the Chinese aid system evolved since 1950, while still during the Cold War, and then the Chinese sort of agenda at that moment, not only to kind of support the African continent was as a kind of solidarity, international solidarity. At the same time, it also had another mission, on one hand to anti-American imperialism, on the other hand the Soviet imperialism. So at that moment, it's such a highly political issue to develop, to deliver aid. So if we reflect at that moment from Europe, the aid system, or Americans' aid system, maybe it should be rather fair that we don't see transparency as a principle at all. So for China's case, since our political system and all the issues, the domestic situations, so aid system hasn't been changed so much. Only since the new century, there are some changes, especially according to international standard. There are lots of improvement. The most recent improvement I want to say is just the beginning of March. There was a new law just passed by the government, which was all the aid projects need to take the environment consideration, and then the MOFCOM, Ministry of MOFCOM, which was the upper head of the Department of Foreign Aid, they actually had the right to monitor, to check all the aid project that is finished by all Chinese companies. So this is another new progress I want to highlight, which means there are lots of debate among civil society, among scholars, what kind of international standard we should join, which maybe is not so much relevant with the Chinese situation. So there are lots of spaces for civil society to attend, to play a role, and then also to try to help to improve the situation. So in my view, generally, the aid system is improving now, and then even transparency, because if you pay attention to last year, the year before, there was a new white paper for Chinese aid, and according to this paper, all the number were there. So you actually can check, of course, if you think of each of the country. They haven't get so much detailed information, but you have, according to sectors, which sector the aid has been contributed. There are the information. So, in terms of your question about investment, I also think it's also there is a big space for civil society to monitor and also to improve, because there are lots of cases that we can show you that there are improvement. And then I do think we have to think of China is rather, although it started to present in African continent since 50s, but in terms of really have lots of different agenda, not only have the aid agenda, also have investment, have economic considerations, so-called national interest. it is rather a new player. So it's a learning.
Ms. Nazir, perhaps let me come to you. You spoke about NEPAD having its own, or African countries having their own principles within the NEPAD framework. And as we're talking about some of these things, in terms of regulation, people are saying that you can't conflate issues. You have to take into consideration the fact that perhaps you need to tailor-make some of the financial markets to the individual countries. But that also runs into the challenge that, as we're talking about, that countries perhaps are not transparent enough about what they're doing. Sorry, the mic is just kind of acting up. But so, what are the principles, and how does it play into that argument?
I think it's important that you look at the Union, African Union, as members coming together because they've got some common objectives. But regional integration does not say it does not act outside of national priorities and national needs. And in most cases, when you find even countries getting into a regional bloc, it is because they would like to reap the regional benefits, in terms of collaboration for national development. And I think that is important to keep in mind. And obviously, there will be specifics, but it is so important that Africa has a standard, and in terms of some principles that they would like to see, and across, because that in itself does guide how it interfaces globally with its partners. And for instance, the whole trust that we have that would like to see more of the commercial social collaboration, because that is for us where we see innovation coming through, because Africa does need innovation for agro-processing, value addition, and whether it's productive capacities for manufacturing, we do need innovation. So we see more and more that, okay, fine, how do you now frame that kind of partnership so that we get what we want? Because along the different countries in Africa do not have neither the economic nor the political muscle to be able to face the global partners on their own. And this is why politically there's been a decision that we're going to develop as Africa, for inclusive shared growth, sustainable growth, but through combining the synergies or the strategic positioning of each country to enhance development. At the end of the day, then the citizen does benefit. So, and even in terms of those principles that NEPAD believes in, there is the issue of, say, commercial private sector, the issue of multinational companies coming through. And although the NEPAD does emphasize the role of the private sector, but we're saying yes, there is an important part that the bigger private sector can play, but we would like to focus more on growing domestic private sector, because that is the only way we can retain growth, we can retain dividends from development, so that we can grow as economies and be sustainable. So we do have certain key issues that we'd like to see coming through, more around growing our own domestic capabilities, whether they're financial, institutional, or in terms of human skill sets.
Perhaps I'll get Mr. Sina to weigh in on that, but I'll just go back to the whole issue of, have we spoken about what those principles are specifically? Because let's take, for instance, the whole example of Back of the South that was very
Please,
much...
can you put the microphone? Nobody will understand.
I'm sorry, it just goes on and off. Okay, that's
better. Thank you.
Right. If you look at the example of Bank of the South, for instance, one of the things that was encouraged and spoken about was transparency, even talking about perhaps external auditing. Is that something that NEPAD or African countries are talking about within the development bank aspect? And Mr. Sina, just in terms of the agricultural sector and those external financial outflows, how do you control that? Perhaps Ms. Nazari could answer first.
All right. I think, you're exactly providing the answer to that. Africa has definite standards that they put in terms of, that they apply around negotiating, whether it's with the southern partners or it is with the northern partners. And even if it is intra-Africa South-South cooperation among our own member states, we do have those principles that come up from the NEPAD, which are around promotion of ownership. You don't displace local capabilities, you don't displace local potentials, but you come in terms of partnership to enhance that. So I just think that the principles are quite standard, but it is around that more the enforcement. I think this is where we kind of fail, because like if you look at the mining vision, the charter on natural resources, we have those guidelines. But we fail many times, I think, as African countries when it comes to enforcement and implementation. And this is where, especially in the second decade of NEPAD, we would like to see more of the implementation of those commitments. So while you do have, in terms of well laid out conceptually, the partnership principles, but we would like to see those enforced more through regulatory approaches, the systems that Africa would like to put in place to make sure that it happens. So I think it's more around moving from the notions to the practice.
Mr. Sina, some of those environmental and social safeguards within that context?
Yes. Yes. I think before we comment on those environmental safeguards, in my opinion, transparency of public money is completely non-negotiable. Either it's coming from Brics countries or non-Brics countries, but since it's an international financial flows, coming for development purpose, but it's a public money from recipient from donor citizens. At the same time, it's coming to the boundaries beyond and coming to the benefit of recipient citizens. And the recipient government is supposed to be paying back those debt, as our colleague from Aphrodite said, that lack of information. Ultimately, the public is going to repay the loan to the citizens in the donor countries through their governments. So I think it's in principle, there is going to be complete transparency in the transactions. That's my opinion. And in terms of environmental safeguards, I think either for the public money or through private investments, through private sectors, in whatsoever sectors, be it mining, be it agriculture, I think there needs to be minimum aggregate standards on how to do those environmental safeguards on forcible evictions, land grabbing, and other environmental degradation. These are involuntary settlements. Since most of these transactions bilaterally, there are recipient systems in place. But at the same time, when you are doing this business through multilateral development banks like Brics Development Bank, we need to have those mechanisms in place before the transaction starts. Before any investment project is being sanctioned, I think we need to have those accountability mechanisms in place so that the citizens at large is going to have one such mechanism to hold their government and the Brics Development Bank accountable.
All right. And perhaps, Ms. Marisera, I can get you then to talk about how civil society can be involved in, for instance, the policy strategies and definition of, for instance, credit policies that would prevent some of these practices from continuing.
Okay, so what I meant was, it's like when we define ODA according to the countries, it is different. When China is defining ODA, so we are saying it needs to be made very clear what is ODA, because you find with China, you can't tell whether how much is the grant element, how much is the consumer. So that is all we're trying to say. Let's have things, it's not that the Chinese should adopt it that way, but we are saying let's have things made clear. When you say ODA or when you say aid, how much is it and how do you calculate it? If everything is above board, then there will be no challenge with the civil society.
But just in terms of, say, financing criteria and credit modalities, what role can civil society play? Or have you thought about it as civil society, some of the definitions that you say you're not getting from governments that you would say would help alleviate some of these problems?
Okay, it's like the definitions are there, they are written, some of them are in black and white. But we were concerned about the kinds of agreements that are signed by the Brics and the African countries, where things sometimes are not done above board. And we're saying, as civil society, we just need people to know. For example, there's a model that I said in my last in the last part of my presentation, we were talking about an Angolan model, where we are saying for them to come and construct a dam, for example, or a bridge, there is need for them to get access to resources. I think she mentioned something to do with the extractive industry. To say they are entitled to a certain portion of the resources. And we are saying, is it really proper for African governments to get involved in such agreements, which are like you are committing the future generations' resources?
Okay, well, we've been sort of broad in the discussion, so let's allow questions from the floors. I'll take 5. If I could ask you to please identify yourself, and if you'd like to pose a question to anyone in particular, please also note that, and we'll get the panel. 1, 2, 3. Please, somebody at the back there, 4, and okay, I can't. 5. Okay. Shall we start on this side?
Good morning. Thank you so much for this discussion. I'm Dr. Syed from UN Women, and I'm so delighted to hear from the Honorable Deputy Minister about the development framework and also the social protection, especially the healthcare and the example from Ghana and other countries. And we are also hoping that as per the Sanya Declaration, there are 24 which highlighted as social protection and the gender equality and the empowerment of women and the public health, the youth, and also the protection from HIV and AIDS. So these kind of principles will also be highlighted in the Durban summit. And also, since women contribute more than 40% in agriculture, the Brics Bank will also come up with policies of development framework and also giving subsidies and other benefits to the women, especially. Thank you.
Thanks. My name is Mzukisi Kolo from the University of Victoria. I have 2 questions. The first is with respect to the issues raised by Sina on that the BRICS countries are, one of their values is to address governance deficit. I find this somewhat questionable, or rather superficial in a sense, because countries like China, during the contestation for the IMF headship, they endorsed Christina Lagarde ahead of candidates from the developing world. Russia put its weight behind the US candidate. I think the really governance deficit issues that the BRICS countries can address are within the BRICS countries. Because it is rather insufficient that we sort of celebrate the BRICS elites, the BRICS leaders, so that they will address governance deficits when there are governance deficit issues within their countries. And some of the countries, especially the other BRICS, they make a very clear point that whatever reform in terms of seats within the IFIs should not, if we call for reforms to include great African representation, they make it clear that that should not affect their own seats. And the final question is to Deputy Minister Fransman. Russia has published its BRICS strategy on the website, transparent, clear, and this is a country not known for transparency. But South Africa, which is a democratic country, constitutional, its citizens are scrambling to find the BRICS strategy. What are the security issues in the strategy? And perhaps finally, is there a broader emerging market strategy within which South Africa is pursuing its BRICS engagement, or is it just focusing narrowly on these 4 countries? Thanks.
I think there was a gentleman on that side. Sorry, I can't see.
Hello, thank you very much for the excellent presentation. My name is Oliver Stigmo. I'm a professor of international relations at the University of Vargas in São Paulo. And my question is, we were talking a bit about standards, international standards, Paris Declaration, etc. And it's quite striking to me that the so-called emerging donors, such as Brazil, are quite reluctant to engage in these existing structures because they're seen as dominated by established powers. So it's perhaps not that much about the actual content of these agreements, but that it's politically not viable to sign up to them because for an emerging power that's seeking more space, it's just nonsensical to sign up to something that it boxes Brazil in, and it reduces its freedom to seek to find new ways and perhaps innovate about what's possible. So, what do you think should be, well, what do you think is the solution to that? That there is something, there's rules out there, but for an emerging power it seems politically difficult to engage in them. Does it make sense to seek to reform them from within, or is there space to set up perhaps a competing set of rules that emerging donors can sign up to?
Naisan Kasharaji from the South African Institute of International Affairs. I want to thank the panelists for addressing the issue of transparency and accountability within the BRICS and with regards to engagements with Africa. There's another issue which I didn't hear touched upon, which is characteristic often of the BRICS engagements with Africa. Often the BRICS countries, when providing development finance to African countries, they provide assistance tied to companies, contractors, technical assistance from that home country. So effectively it's tied aid. How does that?
The Chinese government changed its aid delivery system, which previously is rather government, which means there's no specific body, but just the government itself send people to implement aid project. But since 1995, there was a law that all the projects should be finished by the Chinese company, which they want to use the market system to encourage competition and encourage the Chinese companies to grow up in the foreign, overseas environment. So this is one change. And in recent years, there have been lots of criticized about the quality of this aid project. So then there was, of course, a hot debate about how this system could be improved. So to include NGOs, whether it's governmental or non-governmental, to change the system is one of the solutions they found. So far, such as under the China-African Cooperation Forum, there was a NGO sub-forum, and they actually are monitoring lots of issues. So this is one case I want to just tell you. And then in terms of if there will be more, I do think so. There will be more NGO, not only from China, even from the hosting countries. Actually, recently, before just the date I flew to South Africa, I was interviewed by China Daily. They actually asked me, or should government prefer to work with the host countries NGO or Chinese own NGO to implement a project? I just my answer is both, because you should also involve Chinese civil society NGOs to grow up. So this is one answer to the last question. I also want to address a little bit about the international standards. The question from that gentleman about this Brics. Of course, there is a very obvious hesitation from Chinese side to get involved in this so-called donor harmonies system, which also there were lots of debate among our scholars how we work with this international standard. Should we just pretend we do it, or we have some alternative ways to improve our own system? There are lots of this kind of, and then since 2007, I can say for sure, there were lots of initiatives from Western side, such as trilateral dialogue, not only from America, also from Europe, and then now it's still undergoing this kind of a system. And then recently, we were actually approached as a Chinese scholar several times from OECD countries, even the Minister of Development himself or herself asked us whether there is a potential or possibility that China joined the Busan consensus to really accept all this international standard. I would rather think, my observation is the Chinese government rather the tendency is still through bilateral dialogue, whether it is African as one pool or specific countries, to get their understandings first, and then to just really state what they think about this standard. If it is accepted by the African side or even other recipient countries, and then it's okay, there's no problem. And then, but if it's something African side rather think it's a reluctant attitude, and then Chinese government would not accept it. Even this kind of a trilateral dialogue, there is a obvious hesitant attitude. So this is my observations through Chinese experience. Probably my colleagues could add.
Deputy Minister, if I could just come to you to answer a question about the emerging market strategies, and if you could also align it to the whole issue of the investment grade status, how, for instance, an initiative like this may not necessarily work precisely because of that. If it doesn't get a buy-in from the US or any of the so-called international organizations that counter the development strategy that developing countries are trying to pursue.
Yes, but let me deal with that very direct issue as well, about how public is our strategy. And then the gentleman try and play off to Brics countries around who's more and not. I think the reality is the last couple of months we've been right across South Africa. There's, for example, a site on our Brics approach. It's there, it's real, it's visible. We've gone to every province in South Africa, and we've gone to every general urban area as well as the rural communities across the country. And through what we call the public diplomacy outreach. The people that went there was at least a national minister, at worst a deputy minister, with all the relevant departments. And the objective was to go and get perspectives from communities of how do they see, how do we bring this international engagement at a very high end, right to the ground, which is obviously a challenge many times because you're speaking about international trade, international politics, etc., etc. But I must admit, very, very good quality discussions took place there. To give you one example, the discussion was how do we in fact empower SMMEs and the issue about gender and women entrepreneurs, etc., and how do we capacitate them vis-a-vis the exchanges with the Brics countries, for example. So there is a body of information. We are now thinking about a provincial chapters when it comes to, for example, Brics. How do we take it down and institutionalize it at that level? The people that we've connected with was the governments, provincially and local government, civil society was part of that, NGOs, community-based organizations, etc., and the entrepreneurial structures. So I think it's there. It's very real, and it has happened already over the last 2-3 months. What we must do beyond this week is then to find a report back mechanism, and how do we in fact take it back. And we would want, we really call on you to make suggestions in that regard. I think the issue around emerging markets and are we defined only to these countries, or do we have an approach beyond? I think the elephant in the room is the fact that there is an approach that whenever there is an engagement with the new emerging markets, China, India, etc., that there would be an unequal relation. That's the elephant in the room. Now it's an unfair elephant in the room, precisely because the relation between Africa and countries in Africa and the West, in fact, has left us with the refugees of today. So we did not see skills enhancement taking place. One of the strategic challenges for our partnership, whether it's with Brics, whether it's with other emerging markets, whether it was the Old North, the issue is the ability of countries, South Africa and countries in Africa, at the level of skills. And I will consistently raise that issue because it's technology, it is financial skills, it is governance institutions and governance build. So the problem is that we look at the new emerging economies through the lens of what we've experienced historically. And I think that would be an unfair judgment call, precisely because one of the countries that I had to closely work with as a special envoy not so long ago was Madagascar. If you actually unpack the financing institutions in the country, it's beholden to the former colonial ruler. Even 40 years, 50 years ago, they had independence, but still. And you pick up a lot of that. The debate with the Brics countries and the broader emerging markets is different. There is a much more credible discussion taking place. So even the notion and the concern about accountability, we can say that even the accountability discussion with Brics countries, even in particular with China, that's not even a debate where we are sitting. Because those countries, in fact, is embracing that. South Africa, not so long ago, 7 years ago, the former General Secretary of the Textile Workers Union is now the Minister of Economic Development in South Africa, Ibrahim Patel. When he was the General Secretary of the Textile Workers Union, he, with government, as well as with China, struck a strategic relation on textiles. There was an assumption that China will not have a special dispensation with South Africa to, in fact, help protect the type of textile industry in South Africa. China has signed on to it. The problem was not if China was ready. The problem was were we ready as South Africa to make sure that we actually benefit from that quota process. Now I can now say that the lessons learned out of it, we were not as ready. So we didn't have a reluctance of China not to cooperate there. So the issue about national interest vis-a-vis international geopolitical interest, that's there. That contradictions will be there. But the reality is we are sitting now with an access to the emerging market as South Africa and countries in Africa that are able to help us overcome. Just imagine for a moment if that wasn't there. Whilst you've got the West and old traditional partners with Africa that initially caused havoc in terms of the type of practices here, but secondly, doesn't have the type of money to spend. Just think about what would have happened. So where we are currently is we are saying we are pragmatic. We don't expect when Brics countries meet on geopolitical discussions on an appointment, for example, that we always necessarily have to agree. We don't expect that. We expect a baseline of principles in agreement, and many people have spoken to that, and then to step up that debate. What we would want to see, however, over the next while, is the focus on institutional build. It is the focus on the enhancement of our capacity to better engage and to more strategically engage with, because as it is, not far from us, you'll find interventions in Somalia. The other day, Somalian government is telling me that there is regular, and I'll not say where, but there's regular international discussions around Somalia and the support. And they're saying the problem is the differences between the Brics countries and South Africa in particular and the other continental countries where that debate is happening, is that it happens as if they bring the contractors in, but the debate currently starting to emerge with Somalia in the Brics environment is how do we in fact create to help this reserve bank, the National Bank of Somalia, to be strengthened. How do we make sure that the judiciary, the police, the governance institutions of Somalia are actually being strengthened? So a lot of our focus will be on institutional build, so that the capacity.
To interrupt you, Deputy Minister, let's talk about that. I'd imagine common ideology is required. So if, like the issue was raised, that there is a candidate to be picked at the helm of the IMF, even if you have different understandings in terms of financial autonomy, one would imagine that you at least have commonalities in terms of the candidate that you want and the kind of principles that he or she would espouse. So that, I think, has been the question, but why are we failing to do that? And that's why I also raised the issue of the investment grading status. That, for instance, we've had the Asian International Monetary Forum or the European International Monetary Forum, and some of those organizations not being able to take off precisely because of that, because they're judged differently about the so-called Bretton Woods organizations that believe that they don't really align with what they want.
I've used the word being pragmatic. And I've said there is national interest also vis-a-vis geopolitical interest. So when there is a Brics formation, it would be in fact good for us to most of the times agree, but it's also not necessary always to agree. In fact, when that position came available, it was in fact soon after, I think, that we've even joined the Brics. But was there discussion amongst the countries? Yes, there was a discussion. Were we able to get finality into it? No, as an agreement. So we are saying is that we are evolving. We are in a process of evolving into very serious, take the square kilometer array. When the discussion on the SKA took place, we know of serious lobbying among certain countries that has taken place with the Brics countries that were part of the decision making of the SKA. Now the square kilometer array would be a 30 billion rand investment into, yes, the South African space, but broader into our region. And what we've seen with credible engagement through the Brics process, the Brics countries were able to start speaking together in that. So I think at times we'll be able to get it right, at times we'll not be able to get it right. The baseline, however, is we must consistently engage. In terms of the ratings and the investor credibility issues, over the next few days, we'll be thoroughly discussing that. And even at that, and I didn't want to get into the detail because the finance people must announce those things. But even in that, we are seeing an embracing of principles that's different to the principles operative at the IMF. Where even the big countries within Brics, the mega ones, are able to say they actually appreciate the developmental trajectory in which Africa is all about. So the debate around the development state then becomes relevant. And the good thing for us is we are not having different hard views on it. We've got possibly tactical difference at times, and I think that's where we are. We're going to be quite pragmatic in our engagement.
I thought you wanted to respond to some of the
Oh, I just wanted to respond to the guy.
I just wanted to respond to the guy who raised that the Brics should not really abide or be part of the international norms that have been set by different. In my opinion, I think I tend to agree with him. Because most of those international standards, maybe they were set when these countries were once recipient countries, and the kind of relationship was a donor-recipient. But we are saying now, when they are dealing with Africa, they need to define their norms and standards in a partnership form, I would say, modality, where we are talking about partnership between Africa and the the BRICS countries. Then secondly, there was an issue that was raised, I think, a concern about the companies that will come from the BRICS countries coming to Africa, where they will bring in their own companies, they will bring in their own labor. I think it's a serious concern within African countries. And there was something like a strike that was we had in Zambia. So it's a serious concern that Africans, I think at the end of the day, we are saying Africans, they need to negotiate fair and equitable, deals with the BRICS countries so as to ensure transparency. And when we say transparency, it's also to do with the labor laws or labor standards, all the things that are happening. Thank you very much.
I also want to add something about this issue, high aid. Yes, because it's so important. I think there are lots of rumors, not only in the African continent, but everywhere about Chinese bring so many laborers, even prisoners in this continent. I want to just add some information because my own research since 2006 bring me to various African countries. I visited lots of Chinese companies to say what the real situation is. What I found actually is really various. The situation. It's according to the African continent, just as what Deputy Minister said. Yourself, are you ready already? Because like Uganda's case, there was in their labor law, there's nothing about the proportion between the foreign laborers and the local labor. So you just say, it's freelance, whatever you bring, how many Chinese labor, it's okay, it doesn't matter. And then for the Mozambican cases, it's really different. The proportion according to labor law is 1:9, and then their government rather strictly implement. They send the impact inspectors every. I don't know the frequency, but frequently they send the inspectors. So this country, you say this labor law rather strictly, and then also Mozambican government, they actually translate this labor law into Chinese since 2007, a long time ago already. So they are rather prepared. And another case I want to raise is Angola. Actually, Angola, there is a clear regulation about 3 to 7, this corruption. But actually, because the government, the president want to fastly implement their infrastructure, and then through their presidency house, they get some contract with the Chinese company, nearly all, especially those Chinese state-owned companies, and they show me their contract. There is nothing about labor regulation. You don't have to respect the labor law at all because it's special. So I also want to talk about sectors because
before you get to that, if you'll allow me to interrupt you, because I'm very enabled by that, because it's almost as if we're implying that even as BRICS countries and its cooperation, that they shouldn't be tailor-made for specific countries, industry interests, for instance. And we'll take the example of Thailand, for instance. It has very stringent measures and rules, regulations for multilaterals that would like to come into the country, even including raising taxes. If a multinational would want to bring in labor under their own conditions, are you saying that, for instance, BRICS should have a very loose agreement around that, just sort of have an understand that we're all friends and we should all trust each other, and therefore what works for me works for you?
I think it's really according to the reality, because such as we also take Angola's case in terms of IT sectors. Since they haven't got one Chinese company, Huawei, Zhongxin, entered this country, they haven't got enough technicians yet about it. Although for Chinese
but who makes that determination? Is it China or is it Angola?
No, I think company itself, they will decide how many they want to bring. Because as IT workers, you may not stay externally too long because it's so expensive. And then so they rather want to have the local. It's like Huawei's branch in Uganda. Actually, you have 80% the local.
I think you said something about the private sector's role in that and perception of some of these deals being so-called land grabs.
Yes. I think the land investments could be approached from two different perspectives. One is the human rights perspective, where land deals could be termed as land grabbing, and the ethical case human rights perspective. And the second one is on the risk aversion perspective, where the companies who are investing in land deals has to take their own due diligence before going for any investments and taking into consideration the resettlement and rehabilitation policy. But land is such a complex issue, and in every state, in every country, there are different land acquisition rules. And sometimes, or most of the time, or quite often, we never know that which country has got what kind of tenancy act in place. And the whole idea of land being taken by the state to hand it over to the agency, as in the case in Ethiopia, we have seen it, or in the Zambia, where the local chiefs could be approached if the land is not available from the land investment agency. So the whole issue lies in what is the land acquisition policy in place in individual countries, and how this individual government is trying to attract the foreign direct investments so that companies from abroad, not only from Brics, but beyond Brics, because the investments are coming from all across on the invitation of the government. Having said that, the minimum due diligence which I foresee, I observe, is that the environmental safeguards and the community safeguards should be in place before making any of those land deals. And since if the government is involved from Brics, either through the public investment or the individual companies who are coming on their own, I think that disclosure of those documents and the community consultations should be in place before signing the contract agreement, if there is land involved to be displaced, community involved to be displaced. I would like to take on the issue of transparency and the golden standard. Since I was part of this ITI process in 2011, when the standards were being agreed upon, the whole idea is that we have to understand the nuances of transparency and standards. As the colleague has said about the tight aid from India, I say it's not tight aid. I would counter it's a tight concessional loan. And then loan and aid would be debatable, that what could be termed as aid and what could be termed as tight loan. It's a trade finance instrument, and I would like everyone to go back and see how the trade financing is transparent, how much transparent the trade financing across the world. I will leave it there, but at the same time, our fight with transparency globally is to include other official flows also in the whole ambit of international aid transparency standards. It's not exclusively official development assistance. And then the private financing supported by official sources in terms of export credit and the kind of issues which Afrodebt and Eurodebt have been working for the last 30, 40 years, the whole issue of debt accumulation due to export credits, just trade financing. So those are the issues we are grappling with the IITI, and I expect and I request Bridge Development Bank, the Honorable Minister is here, to take into these issues and if possible to take forward the issue of transparency standards to include the transparency of all public money, be it official development assistance or other official flows.
Deputy Minister, on the issue of South Africa and it supposedly representing the rest of Africa, is that a consideration, or is this a purely individual choice that South Africa makes as being a part of this partnership with Brics, as much as the idea may be to extend the benefits to Africa? Where exactly does South Africa stand? Does it join Brics on behalf of the rest of the continent? Does it have legitimacy to do so if it is doing so?
To my brother there, that thing about the AU being a useless, you started then you stop. I think it's a very wrong statement. You see, you see it's extremely wrong. Because you are undermining exactly the progress that Africa has achieved through the institutional mechanisms. It can be a populist perspective, but it's a wrong perspective. And I think you as a brother from the diaspora, I think you should be cautious. Because today people actually recognize what the AU was saying when when we caution the way arms will move even post that Libyan situation. We've said that. And at the United Nations Security Council, when we cautioned and say, be a bit more cautious because we must look at the region, look at the instability today in that region. Precisely because of the AU perspectives that were not taken into account. So the respect for regional integration becomes very critical. Now, there's that other assumption that isn't South Africa doing A, B, and C. I just returned from Addis. I went to the engagement between Japan and Africa. But part of my mission was, as an envoy, to go and brief the Prime Minister of Ethiopia on the Brics process. Now, what did I have to brief him on? That one, this is what we are doing in the context of the Brics discussion. So there's transparency in what we are saying. But secondly, there's going to be over the next day, all the heads of the RECs, the regional economic committees in Africa will be here. All of them. And you know what's going to happen? The Brics partners will sit, the heads of state, and in the morning, the heads of the regions and the heads, for example, the political heads, will meet in Africa on our own. And then we'll discuss what do we as a collective needs to suggest to the Brics partners as well. Can you see the difference? Meaning we're not speaking on behalf of. We have created the forum for the heads of the regions in Africa and the AU head to in fact engage directly with the Brics countries so that if there is interpretation, misinterpretation, also concerns, very real concerns, the type of concerns that you're raising, that all comes there. So that's why we are saying, when we are saying it's Brics and Africa, it is not feeble. We're not just saying that. It's because the institutional process has been built in for it. I think the last question was a very important question. The issue of how do we make sure that we can actually monitor, that there's oversight, and that there's evaluation. We've built that mechanism in. And that's why year on year, we'll make a progress analysis. And hence the introduction of the word pragmatic. Just India. I think I've just registered stat a week ago, 175,000 software engineers they're throwing out year on year in India. Qualifying. Now, if the ICT space is an important space in our global competitiveness, we have to make sure that we get that level of skill. But we don't have that level of skill currently. So therefore, that balance and finding ways of engaging with each other on that level of protocol. So we are extremely conscious of the fact that we need to make sure that we create the relevant institutional build and institutional mechanisms around it. I just think the issue of poverty, in my initial point, the question at the back, the social questions. If you remember where I started off, I said, whatever we do in the context of Brics must reflect in the context of poverty reduction, inequalities, and poverty. Poverty reduction, inequalities, and unemployment. Currently, we are sitting in Africa with a 60% unemployment rate of young people. But it's not only the unemployment rate, it's the unemployability reality as well. And therefore, the importance of an apprenticeship strategy through the Brics program, you're sitting with Brazil, India, and the other countries that have shown how they are able to get people out of abject poverty into self-sustainability. So the infrastructure projects that we talk about is not private sector only. We are talking about social projects, health. We are talking about all of those projects, health infrastructure, etc., road infrastructure, and so on. And the final point, therefore, is the experiences that we can learn. Because here we're sitting with Brazil. Brazil have shown that they are able to create a middle income category. We have seen with both China and India, and that lessons learned out of that, that's the type of experience that we will share. And therefore we thought it's important that the academic forum must be engaging with all these various countries to see what is the lessons learned and how do we in fact therefore are able to capacitate ourselves as the African nations within that process. But I just want to say, it's many times the concern that the skepticism, even in the type of questions, and I think with the exception of the last one and a few others, that it's as if we're still the dark continent, and we're not the dark continent. We've moved on. We've got the National Development Plan. Countries in Africa have a strategic plan. If you actually go and unpack those plans, they talk about development, capacitation, institutional build, mechanization, and we understand that China, for example, have a large pool of people from the rural communities. So they want to see manufacturing there. And that's a healthy debate. We want to see manufacturing here. And that debate will be there, and we'll find somewhere that middle ground. So I think what we're asking of all is to, in a sense, help embrace us around how do we actually take the debate beyond the stigma of the debate and actually look at politics.
Deputy Minister, let's do that. I think the questions really being raised are about, we're not necessarily pessimistic for the sake of it, but we want to understand how some of these things are going to fall. For instance, some of the projects that we are going to invest in from Brics to Brics countries. How's the capital going to be raised from the international capital markets, for instance? Is there going to be market-based institutional reform that we ourselves are going to embrace? How are we going to differentiate the Brics Development Bank from other development banks that exist already, even within Brics countries? Are they going to overlap? What is going to be the Brics Development Bank agenda? Long-term, short-term? Perhaps, Ms. Nazar, if I could get you to weigh in on that?
Yeah, I think what's really, I think, the issue is, as you put it, is exactly what is it that we're going to do, as Africa. And I think the minister has Deputy Minister has pretty laid out basically the vision that Africa has, of course, spearheaded by South Africa around the Brics. And I don't think maybe there's much more, I think that we can say, but what I just want maybe to emphasize on is the whole relationship between inclusive growth and development, and therefore the delivery of health provisions. And go back to maybe a point that the minister, I think, raised around how at times we undermine our own processes and we don't have faith in terms of the things that we put forward. The gentleman asked that, maybe the collaboration looks like it's really around economic sectors only. But I would like just to give you a few examples from Africa where we've benefited around the provision of affordable health services. Egypt and in India have had this collaboration, I think it's India, yeah, and India, have had this collaboration where now Egypt does produce insulin. And it was not available within the Arab region and some parts of Africa, but within that kind of collaboration, we have the provision of affordable health services produced within Africa, but using technologies that are actually coming from that. So you're using the economic angle, but also to support more of the social provision. And a good example in South Africa is around the issue of testing technologies for pregnancy, for what you call it, TB and all that. They have a collaboration and technologies are actually here. But it is now going to, in terms of helping health provision. And going back now to the issue, because there seem to be kind of a thinking that, you can focus on the provision of social services on its own, for human rights and all that, education and all.
I'd like to ask, all these grand proclamations of solidarity and unity, how do those opportunities trickle down to me as an individual? And this is a question that anybody in Brazil, and South Africa, and India, and China can ask. Is Brics focusing on creating any accessible structures and institutions that I can approach in order to capitalize on these opportunities that this membership and this partnership has presented? Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Marisa, if I could ask you to talk about some of those issues, but also let's talk about women. Do you think there's a role that Brics can play a role and ensure that some of these social investments, for instance, are directed towards them and improve the livelihoods of these vulnerable sectors?
Thank you. I think in my presentation, I mentioned that the type of development or development assistance that we have been receiving from the Brics is visible. And I cited examples like when we say construction of hospitals, construction of schools and everything. And to me, I think they are also addressing the issues to do with women. Because if you have got a road which is perfect, which can take you to a hospital, a well-constructed hospital, a well-equipped hospital, I think we are addressing issues to do with women, youth, and children.
Salute to, yes, we were a bit silent, I think, on the issues of youth. But as we know, the youth are basically Africa's future, and they need to have systems to nurture and make sure that we do have entrepreneurship, other than just for youth to look at getting employed somewhere, because these, basically, they form the private sector of tomorrow. So, and just my last words are that, listening to all the, if you look at the malpractices and all the negative things that are happening around South-South collaboration, I think just more of an kind of honest reflection as an African myself is that some of the practices do speak to our own governance issues as African countries, because we do allow them. Because we have a choice, either to pose ourselves as the victims or to be proactive and put in place the systems and institutions that will allow us to stand firm and be principled. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Deputy Minister?
I think the comment around the health and access to medicine, I think we should continuously, and we'll take that thought also up. So one of the things that we'll take up from here is the fact that it's important to reflect it also the social questions in the context of it, and that balance, finding that balance. So I think it's a positive comment that we can take from here. The second thing is on the youth, and it would be for other vulnerable sectors as well in that category. What we require in Africa is a skills database. Do we actually know what is our skill in each of the countries? What's the level of our skill? How do we trade with that skill? Etc., etc. So one of the things that we should do as in the AU process is actually to develop a skills enhancement database. I think that's something that we would take up. There was the African Diaspora conference last year, and one of the things that came out from there was providing the skills database amongst the diaspora. But just think about a mega infrastructure project to be delivered, a 2 billion rand project. If you in fact have a skills database from that local community, and you have the supply database from that local community, and then you have the opportunities created through that mega road or mega energy project, then you can actually start to link the unemployed with the opportunity, but also at the very level of skill that the individual will be. So I think that's where the practicality then starts to emerge. The youth sector in Africa is engaging on some of those issues. Around again, also the labor and the skills related question, I think there's also the ethos of a self. I thought you would raise the point about a country which I will not mention. When there was this call for heavy infrastructure projects, And the government has decided, no, we now need to get people that actually are able to work even in shifts in that process. And I think that's at times the debate. The final point, so the human capital, I just want to stress this, that we can do all of these things. And what we've seen amongst the BRICS countries, we now have a baseline of information of where they are offering bursaries, either, for example, at the high end, or, for example, at the apprenticeship, and we must take that up. And part of, I think, the responsibility of South Africa is then also to generate that information to the various communities. The final point around the victimhood, etc., I think we shouldn't assume anyone will do something for us. We must be able, so we're not going to stand and engage with China or with India and say, please do us the favor. We're not interested in that debate. We are interested in the debate where we can sharply engage. And I know the type of engagement behind closed doors. We mustn't ask them to alleviate our problems. We must actually be able to say, this is the way we'll engage with yourself. And I think that's the constructive engagement that we'll be finding in BRICS. But there's quite a lot of issues that came out, and we'll surely will take some of that up.
Mr. Sina?
Yes, I think as we are in the process of establishing this BRICS mechanism, not only BRICS Development Bank or BRICS think tank forum, academic forum, there are a whole set of mechanisms which are in place and will be strengthened in the days ahead, which will take into institutional building process of BRICS. I, as a citizen of my country, as an Indian, have to look to my government to make them heard about my problems. At the same time, have to look BRICS as a multilateral forum, which where we could collectively engage with all the respective citizens from across BRICS. And as an individual, I think the skill building, as Honorable Deputy Minister said, that the kind of information which is out there regarding different opportunities for youth, in terms of educational opportunities, in terms of scholarship, in terms of bursary, in terms of minimum employment, minimum wages, those kind of things could be a triggering point to start the discussions that what is out there in terms of poverty lines, in terms of, so there are different kind of engagements which a youth can be engaged in. And more specifically, I think some kind of, if there is going to be any profit generated out of the BRICS transactions, it needs to be once again reinvested into the employment and youth and other issues, social sector issues, and there we can probably create a mechanism to award scholarships, bursaries to BRICS citizens and participate in the BRICS processes.
Ms. Liu?
Thanks. I think I want to just sort of conclude relating with the questions coming from the backside about labor issues. China rather bring rather low-skill workers to Africa. Why is that? I actually asked the same question when the first time I came to Africa to do my field work, to field studies. Why they came with this so low skill. Actually, don't forget, China is also a developing country, and then we still have a large number of people living in poverty. So this rural area people, they need a job. They need live to their livelihood as well. So it's the same situation, very similar. And then what I can foresee now is this year it has been changed a lot, and then each of the year after the Spring Festival, after people reunited with their family, there is a kind of talking about how much famine of laborers we are facing too. So which means that this type of levels of labor is getting less and less. And then you probably know that the labor cost is getting higher and higher. So there is a situation, a trend that China is facing to the upgrading of their manufacturing. So which means there's a very big potential that this level of industries coming to Africa regarding to the labor prices. But there is obviously there is another issue, key issue about skill. How to transfer this kind of skill to Africa is, I just want to still take the infrastructure as a very important sector. I think because this kind of a transfer has been there since. Let me don't say since. I just want to use Tazara Tanzam Railway as one of the kids to show you. I took the train to visit the whole line and then noticed that most of the passengers, they just bring some small goods from their livelihood and then to other area and they change their life. And also another case is Bengala Railway in Angola. I took that train. It's the same thing. People, because of the infrastructure, and then they have their just the women, children, they have the way to do some small business, and therefore they have some capital, small size maybe. And this is one change. This is one improvement. And the other things, since the railway during the process is building, and then this basic skill was transferred, and then later on, people just upgrade, and then you can see the good, how to say, in IT sectors, actually, like what I just said in Uganda. It's a common trend that the Chinese company trained this technicians, and then they go to work for other, like very international brand of the company to work. Yeah, this is the opportunity we can.
Thank you very much. That is Ms. Haifan, Center for African Studies at the University of Beijing, as well as Ms. Florence Nazari, Head of Capacity Building, New Partnership for Africa's Development Agency, NEPA, Mr. Vinay Sinha, Expert on Development Aid and South-South Cooperation, India, Eleanor Maricela, Africa Forum, Initiative on Debt and Development, as well as the Honorable Deputy Minister, Marius Fransman, Department of International Relations and Cooperation in South Africa. I'd just like to say thank you very much to all of the panelists for taking the time out to be here and speak to us. We do realize that there is some logistical problems, so we all sort of came together in a very haphazard manner and not quite having time to get together and chat. Deputy Minister, especially to you, I know your counterparts are behind closed doors, as you said, and you're still here with us, and we really do appreciate the respect that you've given us to have a frank discussion with you. And all of you, I think it was a frank discussion. Thanks to Oxfam and NEPAD for the public dialogue opportunity that we've had. Hopefully we'll have more. In the process of Brics, I hope all of us, either individually or collectively, will get together and sort of talk more about some of these issues. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for your time.